Now, as we continue our study in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, we move on to part 2 of the human-demon hybrid dilemma. And we're not going to reread all of the 4 verses, but we will reread verses 1, 2, and 4 here so that we can highlight the topic. And then we're going to look at 3 key questions here, and then we're going to look at 5 points which are absolutely irrefutable. 4 of the 5 are from Scripture, and one of those 5 are things that we can observe right here today. The first verse in chapter 6 reads, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." I'm going to pause there for just a second, because the first place that a person will focus on when they want to tell us that there are human-demon hybrids, that is, that fallen angels, and demons are fallen angels that roam the earth, I have no problem with that, that they want to go to Job chapter 1 or Job chapter 2 verse 1, and they want to talk about the sons of God came along with Satan when he went to the Lord to challenge him concerning Job. And the problem you have there is context. Just as with many words and many expressions, especially when they're only used a few times in Scripture, such as this expression, when you look at them, you have to look at the context to see how it's used. And then you have to look at not only the context, but you have to look at the entire passage and reconcile it doctrinally with other passages that use the same principle. And this is why I reiterated so many times in the first message how and why God exacts judgment upon mankind and upon the earth. So we'll get back to that in a bit. Now, verse 4, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown." Okay, I have no problem with anything in there. God said it. I believe it. We have record right in Scripture of men who were significant giants after the flood, well after the flood. A very popular giant we know of is Goliath. There are various accounts on how tall the man actually was, depending on how you translate the term cubit, but he was a big fella. He was a lot bigger than pretty much anybody that's walking the earth today. And there were others in his family. It seemed to be a genetic condition of some sort, so it seemed to run in the family line. Children and brothers and so forth, close relations seem to have a similar condition, so it seemed to have something to do with genealogy. And so we look at this and we see that yes, there's definitely a link here, definitely a biological link of some sort, so that all makes sense. So the science works. But we have to remember conditions both before and for quite some time after the flood. The human condition was quite different than it is today. That is, people lived longer. People were still quite healthier as the body began to decay more and more, as our lifespans became shorter and shorter. These effects were not seen as much. We do know that there is a condition, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, 2 conditions actually that are kind of intertwined, that can occur throughout a person's entire life, and sometimes it can significantly shorten their lives. But in a person whose genetics were much better adapted, they might live a lot longer and get a lot larger. So let's start in the beginning here. This concept of the sons of God and the daughters of men, addressing this in verse 1 through 2 and 4. There are three questions we have to look at. Who must they be according to Scripture? Okay, we can speculate all day long, but we have to answer a question. Who must they be according to Scripture? What does Scripture allow them to be? Does it allow them to be a hybrid between humans and demons? Does it allow them to be the result of a male demon taking a human form and a female human? Or must they be a union between a male human and a female human? And if so, then who are the sons of God and the daughters of men? 2, who must they not be according to Scripture? Is there a restriction? Is there a reason why they cannot be the union of a human male and a human female? Is there a reason why they cannot be a union of a demon that has taken human form and a human female? Okay, we have to look at that. Number 3, why did God judge the world in the flood? And again, we have to look at why God judged the world for every reason and apply that to the flood. The flood was not unique in a judgment. The flood was one of many judgments. It was the first totally catastrophic judgment of its type. We could argue that Eden was as well, the fall, but it was the first en masse judgment where there was a mass of human beings. And there will be another one called the Great Tribulation. The first major one, of course, was the fall when man lost his place in Eden, but the first en masse one was the flood. The second one will be the Great Tribulation, and the third one will be the final judgment upon the earth when we come to the new heaven and the new earth at the end of the millennial kingdom. That will be the great white throne judgment. So there are 3. So let's look at 5 irrefutable points from Scripture and answer these questions based on these 5 irrefutable points. It's that 4 of the 5 are from Scripture, 1 is from observation. Right? We need to look at things whether we like them or not, and we need to look at things whether they agree with what we've been told or not, and we need to look at things whether they feel good or not. There's a conservative talk show host out there, I won't mention his name, but he has a very popular saying, facts don't care about your feelings. And while we're to be compassionate as Christians, we're to love people enough to tell them the truth. After all, we're supposed to tell the world about Christ, right? I mean, the Great Commission appears no less than 3 times in the New Scripture. It appears at the end of Matthew. It appears at the end of Mark. It appears at the beginning of Acts. 3 very appropriate places to appear. Jesus told us 3 times to go out and proclaim Him to the world. Yet most Christians are not doing that. They're sitting back judging the world. Excuse me. That's our job, folks. That's our job. However you find a way to do that, however the Lord leads you to do that, tell people about Jesus. That's your number 1 job. You want to glorify Christ? Great. Live a good, godly lifestyle. Learn His Word. Learn of Christ. Follow Him. Tell people about Jesus. And be ready for His Word to challenge you. Be ready for His Word to challenge you, because it will. It will challenge you. I can't tell you how many times His Word has rubbed me the wrong way, but that way I get polished. You don't get polished without some abrasive. And this, oddly enough, is a topic that polished me. It rubbed me the wrong way at one point. But it got me right. Because Scripture must agree with Scripture, and Scripture must agree with fact, and Scripture must agree with truth, because His Word is truth. Jesus said, sanctify them by thy truth. Thy word is truth. Number 1, angels do not procreate. nor were they created to do so. Matthew 22:30, we learn that the angels in heaven are not like human beings on earth. They do not marry. They are not given in marriage. There are people that try to sidestep and say, yeah, but when they come to earth, they have higher powers than us and they can do this, that, and the other thing. Nowhere in Scripture, nowhere will you find angels being given the power to either procreate or take on a form of procreation. They cannot procreate with one another, and they cannot take on a form that can procreate. You will not find them in the beginning of creation procreating anywhere. You will not find them, they're not created for that purpose. They're created specifically for service to God and for service as He commands. Many are servants to us as guardian angels. We learn that in Hebrews chapter 1. Number 2, only God can create life. Genesis chapter 1 shows us that God is the only one there at the beginning. There's no one else there but God. And God creates plants. God creates animals. God creates mankind. He creates all of these things on the earth. He's the only one there. There's nobody else there. It's just God. So nobody else can be doing the creating except God. Right? Satan shows up a little bit later in the garden, but who do you think created him? Okay? And so God's the one doing the creating. In Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 through 19, we have a pretty fascinating account too. You see, Moses was performing miracles as God directed him. He turned a staff into a snake, and the wizards and magicians with their enchantments, they were able to perform this illusion and do something similar. But Moses' snake showed what charlatans they were, because his snake ate their snake. Moses performed some other miracles at the direction of God, and they copied some of them. Their magicians copied some of them. But the first one they couldn't copy was when his staff struck the ground and the dust, dead dust, no life in it at all, became lice. It became lice. It was alive. They tried to do it. They couldn't do it. You know why? Because that required creating life. They couldn't make an illusion like they could with a snake. They couldn't do a little sleight of hand and slip a stick away and slide a snake in there. They couldn't use little chemicals or little tricks or little whatever to try to copy and mimic what Moses had done here. The ground was struck and the air filled with lice. The dust particles changed immediately. They metamorphosized into lice. They couldn't do that because nobody can. The only one that can create life is God Himself. He must put life into it, and only He can do that. Even something as small as a little louse, something that makes your head itch if it gets on there and starts gnawing on your scalp. Only He could do that. Number 3, all life must proceed after its kind. This is a doctrine of first occurrence here that cannot be broken. God never, throughout His Word, He never changes that. He never changes it. He must proclaim that is something that He ordains. No one has power over God. And this is where God's sovereignty stands supreme. God is sovereign. Okay? God is sovereign. So, God's sovereign proclamation in Genesis is that everything must proceed after His kind. He says it in Genesis 11 through 12, Genesis 21, Genesis 24 through 25. If God says it once, it's important. If He says it twice, it's very important. If He says it 3 times, you better listen up. 3 times in Genesis chapter 1, He said that life proceeds after his kind or after its own kind. Life cannot proceed by taking one kind of life and adding it to another kind of life to get a third kind of life. Now, I'm not talking about genetic manipulation and all that other kind of stuff, because that's not the same thing. That's not the same thing. That's not what's being talked about here. And that's not reproduction, by the way. That's not reproduction. And we run into a lot of problems when we start trying to do that. So even if somehow an angelic being would be able to mimic a human, it could still, there's no way it could procreate with a human, because they are not of the same kind. They are not created the same way. Number 4, people get really hung up on the giants. I heard this one preacher, and it's a preacher I respect deeply. Most of the things we agree with spot on. But he got to this point teaching in Scripture, and literally I had to skip over this lesson. Just had to skip this one. He just went on and on about all these giants and everything and all these. And his intonation was that these were human-demon hybrids. And this is how they were formed. And he was going on and on about all these giants through history and so forth. And he's just naming them off and saying how big their beds were and how tall they were and how big their clothing was and everything else. And but you're missing the point. Okay, you're missing the point. God did not destroy the world because Satan corrupted it. God destroyed the world because mankind disobeyed God. God did not judge the world because demons came in and corrupted man and made little demon babies. God destroyed the world, or God reshaped the world, destroyed the world that was there and reshaped it into another world because mankind disobeyed God. What was in man's heart was evil. And what happens to those little demon babies? Do they have souls? Do they not have souls? Do they have half souls? I mean, if they could even be created at all. Which, by the way, we've already established from the first 3, they can't. They can't. Scripturally, they can't be. There is no way they can be. Gigantism is actually a natural, it's a product of the fall, and it's a product of, it's a product of biological byproduct, mutation, and it is somewhat genetic, probably more so in the past. And because our bodies were less susceptible to disease, less susceptible to breakdown, our genetics were stronger in the past. As we get closer back to Eden, our genetic makeup was stronger. We could withstand more changes, more mutations. Now we have more mutations and we can withstand less. People could survive longer with conditions of gigantism or acromegaly. And so they would live longer and get bigger and still be physically capable of doing many things that people with these same conditions today are restricted from. Primarily, this is a condition in which there is a tumorous growth, most of the time benign, near or on the pituitary gland, which releases a lot of growth hormone. It can happen in 2 stages. It can happen when the person is a child, or it can happen after adulthood. If it happens when they're a child, then it's called gigantism. If it happens after adulthood, if it manifests after adulthood, it's called acromegaly. It's really basically the same condition. It just depends on when the onset happens. Some people you might recognize who actually had this condition in modern times are the wrestler Andre the Giant, who eventually died of complications from the condition, Richard Kiel. Robert Wadlow was one of the most popular people who had it. He held the Guinness Book of World Records for a while back in the early 1900s. And the current world record holder is a man who's alive and recently married, by the way, from Turkey, Sultan Kozan. He's currently about 8'3", and he is being treated so that hopefully he won't grow anymore, because he's still a fairly young fellow. But this does affect about 60 out of every 1 million people. So it is a real condition, and it really exists, and people do experience it. People do have it even today. So if it is indeed a condition that would affect certain kinds of individuals, certain people by a demographic or a geographic condition or whatever situation, then certainly you would have giants, more giants in one particular region. And we're told that several times through Scripture. They have a word for it, Nephilim. And we would find them in particular regions. And in fact, we did. And it's interesting that we do find today that people who suffer from acromegaly or from gigantism tend to come from specific regions in the world. They tend to come from particular pockets. They generally are not from all over the world, or if we find them in a particularly rare location, they tend to trace their roots back to one of those pockets, because we're just so much more widespread now than we were several thousand years ago. And number 5, and we reiterated this so many times over the last couple of lessons, but I'm going to do it again. God judged the world based on man's sin and man's sin alone, just as he did at the fall. Romans 5:12. Whereas by one man sin entered into the world, and so death by sin, for that sin passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Right? It's the sin of man. Satan may have been the instrument. He may have introduced the sin into the Garden of Eden. He may have been the bad guy with the bad apple. I don't know what kind of fruit it was. We don't know. The kind of fruit wasn't important. But he was the bad guy who brought the sin in. But we're the one that took it. It's like somebody walking into your house with a bottle of poison water, and they say, "Here, drink it." And say, "It tastes sweet. It'll make you sick as a dog. You'll be in the hospital for 3 days until they finally get it under control. But here, drink it. It tastes great, and you know it's going to make you sick. You know it's going to put you in the hospital, but you drink it anyway." All right? Is that person at fault for bringing it into your house? No. It's your fault for letting them in the first place, and it's your fault for drinking the water, because you knew the consequences. You knew something bad was going to happen. Well, God told them, when you eat of that fruit, you're going to die. Is the fruit going to kill you? No. It's your disobedience that's going to kill you. It's your inability to follow what you've been told. You love satisfying your flesh, your desire, your lust, your want, your curiosity more than you love me. And that's what trickled down all of those years. Those sons of God were nothing more than the people who were, to the best of their ability and their understanding, from the time of Adam forward, trying to follow what they had been taught by their fathers in the way of following and pleasing God. The daughters of men were those that were straying, that were living the ways of the world. Now, why does this match up so good? If we read in Proverbs even, while wisdom is equated to a virtuous woman, which is spoken of at length in chapter 31, a temptress is often referred to as a woman as well, who is someone that draws the author's son away from that which is right and that which is good. And when we see here that the daughters of men are pulling away the sons of God from being godly, that interpretation, that view makes much more sense in light of the entirety of Scripture. We have Jezebel in Scripture. We have the harlot of Babylon in Revelation. We have all of these individuals and all of these terms and all of these expressions that equate the untoward female to drawing the godly man away from God. Now, that doesn't mean that females are bad, of course. We're not trying to intimate that at all. What's simply being done here is that there's a comparison. We see in the Garden of Eden that it was Eve that was tempted. I'm not saying that Eve was evil, that her name is Eve because she's evil. No, we're not saying that. No, Eve was innocent, and in her innocence she was fooled. And in her desire to know more, and in her desire to satisfy something that she felt she was missing, she was deceived into partaking of the fruit. And if we read in 1 Timothy chapter 2, we see that Eve was deceived, but that Adam sinned because he committed the sin. He committed the transgression in full knowledge. He was the bearer of God's one and only law at that time. So there is a responsibility that we have. Whether we are men or women, we are the sons of God. We are sons, we are heirs, and then joint heirs with Jesus Christ. We are not to let the daughters of men, that is, those that would tempt us away, whether they be male or female. We are not to let the daughters of the God of this world tempt us away. We are to put on the whole armor of God, that we are able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Until next time, stay in His Word and stay true to His Word.